Merry Christmas. I hope it is. I realize the odds are against us to have a Merry Christmas. It's going to take some doing this year, and we may think it's actually kind of unusual, but it always does. It always requires an extra measure of us to find that joy, to find that merry in the midst of the messy. Because Christmas is easily one of the messiest times of the year. It's messy financially, it's messy relationally, it's messy in terms of our priorities. It messes with our schedules and our rhythms. Even though it's a very exciting time, it's also a very exhausting time, because we never really seem to have time to do all the things we want to do and see all the people we want to see, especially in this season, in this year. It's wearing us out just trying to make all of the adjustments and prepare our minds and our attitudes and our expectations. And so it's not surprising that even though it's an exciting time, it's an exhausting time. And even though it's a happy time, it's a hard time. It's always a hard time. Christmas is always a hard time because it stands in strict relief the things that we miss, the people who we can't see, what I call the pain of the empty chair, those who we have lost and those who we miss. And so in the midst of the happiness, there's a challenge, there's a difficulty. And maybe that's an important lesson that we too easily forget. It is an unexpected lesson in the season of Christmas, that Christmas is really about a paradox. And that paradox challenges our faith and our values, but the paradox expands our vision and our appreciation. It's my prayer today, as it is every time we get together, that the words of my mouth and the meditations of my heart would be pleasing in God's sight, and that God would use his word spoken by his servant and anointed by his Spirit to encourage us, to uplift us, particularly in this season, that we might embrace the mystery of the paradox of Christmas. Have you ever fallen instantly in love? Do you believe in love at first sight? Does anybody believe in love at first sight? Because I do. I absolutely believe in love at first sight. I remember the moment. It was at 3:24 in the afternoon on May the 9th, 1983. Now, my wife says it was 3:24, but I think it was 3:23 because she was actually involved in labor and delivery and giving birth to our first child. And I remember in that instant, in that moment, I laid eyes on our daughter and I loved her instantly. Unlike anything I had ever experienced in that moment, I knew, even though I knew nothing about this human being, other than she was partially my fault, but her existence, I knew nothing about what lay ahead for her. I knew nothing of her personality, but I knew in that moment, in that instant, that I would die for her. I knew it unquestioningly. It happened 2 more times with our second daughter when she was born. And I wondered, would it be possible to have that same instantaneous affection, that miracle of love at first sight? And it completely was. And then with our third daughter at her birth, I remember wondering, do I have the capacity? Do I have the depth? Do I have the character to love someone again unconditionally? And instantly I did. And I have lived my life with the awareness of that love and that commitment and that affection. But there have been moments, there have been times in raising our daughters and living our life alongside of them when I would have traded them for an old pair of shoes. I mean, they just pushed me to the edge. And the amazing thing is that I never stopped loving them, even though I found it very hard to like them. See, we've been lied to. Not intentionally. I don't think we've intentionally been deceived. I think we've had the wool pulled over our eyes. We've been sold a bill of goods. And it's been going on for centuries. It didn't set out to be this way. I think in the watershed of the rational enlightenment and the movement of humanity to understand the universe scientifically and to eliminate mystery. Over the centuries and throughout the generations, we have moved to a place where we see the world in black and white. That ideally what we want is a world that is constructed as either or. We want a world that eliminates mystery and eliminates paradoxes and eliminates uncertainty. We are comfortable with a rational world that leaves us with sort of an either-or paradigm or a black and white measure. And the more we know, the more certainty we have, the more comfortable we are in the world that we live in. And the problem is that we wind up being either-or people. We wind up being people who marginalize things we don't understand or don't agree with, or are uncomfortable with. And we only surround ourselves with those things that we can comprehend and are comfortable with. And we create a polarized, bigoted, us-them existence, a world of black and white, a world of either or. But there's a better way. And I know that there's a better way because there was a baby that was born. And that baby that was born introduced us to a better way. It is the story that we celebrate every Christmas. It is the story of the arrival of the Savior. It is the story of an infant that was wrapped in strips of cloth and not born in a mansion, but born in a barn and laid in a manger. And the paradox of it introduced us to a better way, not the way of either or, but the way of both and. You see, a newborn baby, a human child, is probably the most vulnerable mammal that is born on the earth. All newborn, whether they're puppies or kittens or foals or goats or calves, have a vulnerability. But even the frailest of most mammals, a newborn animal can find its way to its mother. There is an accelerated development that is required by the vulnerability that they have in the world that they live in, and they adapt rather quickly. A newborn infant is completely helpless. Left abandoned to their own devices, they could not survive at all. It would be absolutely impossible. And their development is so gradual that vulnerability lasts not for days or weeks or months, but for years. That vulnerable human form is like a tissue paper container, and the world is set to tear it apart, and the survival of that child depends entirely on the strength and the protection and the love of those around it. It is completely at the will of others. And yet there is this preposterous notion that the story of Christmas raises up and says, pay attention to this. That into this tissue paper form was poured not just an exceptional human being, but the very nature of God. the all-knowing, all-powerful, omnipotent, omniscient, sovereign creator of the heavens and the earth. That this immutable, unchanging, sovereign God would suddenly subject himself to the vulnerabilities of human existence, not even as an adult, but as a helpless, completely vulnerable infant, is astonishing. It tells us in John's recollection of the story of the life of the Savior that it was the Logos, the one from the beginning. Because in the beginning was the Logos, the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And that Word, that Logos, became flesh. It inhabited a vulnerable human form, and it dwelt among us. And John says, we have beheld his glory. And John knew exactly what he was talking about when he was writing about the glory that was veiled in the human form. Because he was one of only 3 people in human history who saw God revealed in the person of Jesus of Nazareth. It's a story about a day when Jesus gathered Peter and John's brother James, and the 3 of them went up to a high mountain. And it says that as they stood on that mountain, Jesus pulled back the veil. He lifted the curtain on the human flesh that had contained the glory that was there in God. And we don't exactly know. John or Matthew describes it as his face shining like the sun, and his clothes were as bright as a blinding white light. And we don't know what happened in that moment. It's possible that time folded in on itself, and the 4 of them were standing there for what felt like an eternity, because time had no meaning, space had no value. They were in the presence of an immutable, unveiled God. And as they gazed on his glory, they knew that this was not just another average person. This was a paradox. In the flesh, in the human form, was the very creator and sustainer of the universe. John is so bold in his recollection to say that we beheld his glory. We saw his glory, the glory that was one of a kind. Not 1 in a million, 1 in a trillion. 1 in the history of the existence of the cosmos. The one and only. The one who was in every way identified with the Creator, the Father of heaven and earth. This is the ultimate paradox. It is the lesson of Christmas. The lesson of both and. He was both fully 100% human and fully 100% God. It is an impossible paradox. And we are right to look at the Christmas holiday, to look at this season, and to celebrate the message of hope, the message of peace, the message of new beginnings, the message of restoration, the message of the fulfillment of the promises of God, the transformation of human history that was measured out in that moment when that baby was born. And the lesson of the incarnation is a lesson in a paradox. It is a lesson in how it is possible that something can be 200% of anything. That in that moment and in that person and in those years that he walked among us, there was in reality a duality that came together between heaven and earth. So that God was fully present and he was still fully human, immersed in the experiences of our world. But what does it mean? What does it mean to us? How do we practice the paradox of Christmas? How do we become both and people in an either-or world? In a world that encourages us and coaches us and cheers us to pick sides and to choose a team and to associate with the people who are like us, who agree with us, and to push into our corners our individual preferences and our individual values, and to surround ourselves with those who are exactly like us, and to see anyone who is not like us as them, the different ones. How do we live as both and people in an either-or world? I think we know how to do it. I really do. I think we know that that means listening more. That means setting aside our frustration or our prejudices or our anger, our disappointments, or our attitudes that would push us away from each other, and say, okay, yes, and I hear you now. It means being more patient. It means being more gracious. It means being both and people in an either-or world. And if there's one thing that I think we are desperate for, it is more people who are both and people. Because we have plenty of either-or people. For those of us who can be bridge builders and peacemakers, who can set aside our preferences and say, I will meet you where you are. And I can love you without liking you. We can be both and people. I think that's what it means. I think that's what it means to apply the message and the lesson that we celebrate so easily during this season. Because we've been lied to, you see. The wool has been pulled over our eyes. I don't think anyone set out to do it. I think what we have done is we have pursued the safety and the confidence and the certainty of knowing what is true and what is false, what is right and what is wrong, what is good and what is bad, what is black and what is white, because it makes sense of a universe that is constantly reminding us that we don't know anything. And the problem is that the more we press in to try to create an either-or perspective of the world and the universe that we live in, the more we realize, if we are honest, how little we really understand. How much of this life we just didn't see coming. How much of this life is outside of our understanding and our control. And the brutal reminder of the pursuit of rational knowledge and science and the denial of mystery and complexity and paradox is that we eventually come to the end of it. And we don't know how far into it that end is. We don't know whether we have traveled 1 mile out of 100 or whether we have traveled 1 mile out of 1 trillion. We don't even know what we don't know. It is a measure of intellectual dishonesty to say that the world must be this and can never be that. It is a measure of humility. It is a measure of the paradox of Christmas and the lesson of the birth of the Savior that says, what I know is that I know very little, and that I will be not an either-or person, but a both-and person. See, this is the story. This is the story that John introduces us to when he said that in the beginning was the Word, the Logos. And the Logos was with God, and the Logos was God. And that same Word, that same eternal, immutable, unchanging, omniscient, omnipotent God veiled himself in human flesh. in the tissue paper wrapper of a vulnerable infant. And in that, we saw the glory of God. The one and only, the one in a million, the one in a trillion, the one in all of the cosmos, who represents to us the character of the Father, who is not simply a both and God, but an also an inclusive God. It's what we celebrate today. Even in the messiness of Christmas, even in the exhaustion that comes from this exciting season, what we celebrate is the paradox of it. The paradox of a celebration that is filled with uncertainty, of a time that is both happy and hard, that is both exciting and exhausting, that is both merry and messy. And this is my hope for us, that we would know the merry in the messy, and that we would have a truly merry Christmas.